cardiologist who volunteered at a temporary morgue to help process the remains.
The surrealism of the experience it was hard to fathom. Like, I thought I was in a movie. This had to be some sort of setup. And here we were, in a clothing store, being asked to do these sort of impossible thing. I was in my mid-20s, and I started taking freshman biology. I ended up finishing up my PhD, so I do have a PhD in physics, got into Washington University in St. Louis, and so I started there after my PhD in the fall of 1995. I made it through the first 2 years and then got to the hospital in my third year. And that's where I really was happiest, when I was actually dealing with patients. And when I was in the hospital, I just felt like I had made the right choice. So I graduated from WashU in 1998 and went to New York and started my internship at New York Hospital. Spent 3 years there. The mid-portion of my second year, I decided that I was going to specialize in cardiology. I grew up with this fear of the heart as an executioner. When I was growing up, I used to think about my heartbeat. I used to feel it. I would lie in bed and time my heartbeat with the revolutions of the ceiling fan. I was just interested in this thing in my body that is always beating, that beats so many millions of times in the course of a human lifetime, that's so powerful that it can push blood through literally miles and miles of blood vessels in the body. So for a lot of different reasons, I decided that I wanted to apply for a cardiology fellowship. And fortunately, I got the fellowship at NYU. During the first year, which was 2001, that first summer from July to September, we got basic training. So I was still kind of relatively green by the time 9/11 rolled around. The morning of September 11th, my wife and I actually had gone to her obstetrician. That morning, I actually went into work late because I had to go with her to her obstetrician because we were trying to get pregnant. I was in the waiting room filling out some forms, and on the television screen was an image of the Twin Towers, and there was a fire. And someone said that a plane had hit one of the towers, and most people assumed that it was like a small plane. And so I was looking at it, and I didn't really make that much of it. We did our appointment, and then I got into a taxi cab to go down to Bellevue, where I was, working for the week. And in the taxi on the way down, we were on the FDR Drive. It came on the radio that a second plane had hit the other tower. And I remember thinking, what are the chances of that happening? How bizarre. But honestly, even at that point, I didn't think it was a deliberate act, because it was something just out of, my and I think most people's conception that people could actually do this and do a suicide crash into a building. So I got to the hospital, and then it very quickly became clear that this had been a deliberate act and that we should expect casualties at Bellevue, because Bellevue is one of the level 1 trauma centers in New York and did serve that part of the city. We were told to empty the medical intensive care units, the cardiac care units. When we were clearing out the cardiac care unit, someone said, "Oh my God, the tower just came down." And I remember thinking, wow, this person must be really stressed because they're hallucinating. And I remember going over to the window and looking out and seeing only one building and just a massive amount of smoke. That's kind of lent urgency to what we were doing. And then at that point, we were told to discharge any patients who didn't need to be in the hospital, and that we should report for duty down in the emergency room. So I remember when I went down to the emergency room, there were all these surgeons just waiting in the emergency room for casualties to come in. And I do remember 2 episodes in that time I was down there. One was that a cop was brought in, and it appeared he was having chest pain. It appeared he had suffered a heart attack. He wasn't injured physically by the falling debris or whatever, but he had been down there when the tower collapsed. And I remember asking him, something like, how are you doing? And he said, "Doctor, the things I've seen today." And then he just couldn't continue. He just started sobbing. The other thing I remember, apparently a firefighter had died, and a social worker took the wife of the deceased firefighter into a separate room to break the bad news. And I just remember the wife just screaming in disbelief. But I do remember all these surgeons standing around waiting for all this sort of onslaught of casualties, and very few patients were being brought in. And so around mid-afternoon, I went out to the parking lot, and there was an ambulance that was getting ready to go down to Ground Zero. And they were looking for volunteers to go down, and so I volunteered. Drove down, they let us off a few hundred yards from where the buildings had collapsed. We were supposed to be working at a makeshift triage type center, and when I got there, the elevators were stopped, and inside the elevators were medical supplies. The place had been turned into several different departments, trauma and injuries, wounds and fractures, and I went to asthma and chest pain. There weren't that many patients who were in really any department. There were a few firefighters wheezing from, all the smoke, but otherwise there were just very few patients. And I remember at one point just blurting out, "Where are all the patients?" And someone said, "They're all dead." At that point, it just really hit me, the magnitude of the disaster. We were there for probably about an hour and a half, and then at some point, we had to leave the building because another building, and I believe this was the World Trade Center 7 building, was on fire, and they couldn't put out the fire, and there was a fear that it was going to collapse also. We got these stretchers, and we put all these supplies on stretchers, and we kind of lifted them, taking these supplies down to Pace University, and we were going to set up shop there. We went outside and started basically running to Pace University, and it was a disaster zone. It's hard to fathom what had happened. I remember thinking, this isn't New York City, this is Beirut. Bombed out cars, windshields covered in thick ash. Water mains were broken, and there was water running and mixing with all the ash and turning into mud. Up at Bellevue, it was still sunny. It was a sunny day. Down at Ground Zero, where we were, it was like nighttime, like a heavy dusk. So we ended up going to Pace University and setting up shop there. I stayed for a little while, and then the building that had been burning came down. I just remember getting blanketed by smoke. We were probably, maybe 2 blocks away, but the smoke just hit. At that point, I had been in touch with my wife by cell phone. She was I don't feel comfortable with you being down there. You need to come home. So I hitched a ride with a police officer covered in soot and ash. And so I got home probably around 9 o'clock, saw my wife, and we just kind of spent the evening together watching the news, seeing what had happened and trying to process it all. The morning of September 12th, I was planning on going to work. I called one of my co-fellows, and he said that no one was in the department and that some of the doctors had gone down to the World Trade Center site to work in a unit there. And so I was in my neighborhood and I saw a cop car, and I said, I work at Bellevue and a lot of my colleagues are down at Ground Zero. And he said he would take me. I eventually made my way to this MASH unit that had been set up in a firehouse. I could see the twin towers, I could see the base. Sort of the bowels of the buildings were unleashed from the buildings. I mean, there was like all these broken wires and pipes. The street was muddy. There were police dogs sniffing around the rubble. There was like a line of people sort of removing pieces of rock. At some point, someone yelled that they needed doctors in the Brooks Brothers building. I wasn't sure why they were asking, but I volunteered to go with this policeman. We went into the lobby, and there were German shepherds, and there was a lot of broken glass, and there were cops, and there was a dark curtain. The cops who had brought me started to take me in behind the curtain, and someone said, only doctors are allowed back there. And he explained that I was a doctor. And so I went in. I remember there were maybe 3 doctors, a couple of medical students, and a nurse. The medical students and the nurse were sitting behind a table. They had tags with them. They were sort of filling out paperwork or getting directions from these doctors. And then I joined that group. They were talking about processing body parts. Turned out this was like a morgue that had been set up. And they were talking about the protocol for what to do when body parts came in. None of them really knew what they were doing. None of us knew what we were doing. People were just sort of asking questions like, are you supposed to put body parts into one bag or put them into separate bags because they could be body parts from different people? And no one really knew. The nurse and the 2 medical students were sitting behind this table, and they're just sort of waiting for instructions. At some point, maybe a few minutes after I arrived, they brought in part of a human being. It was the lower part of someone's body. The whole torso had been severed from the rest of their body, and all they had was like a pelvis and one leg just attached. And out of this pelvis were like intestines that had broken, that had been severed. When that portion of torso was brought in, the female doctor who was there said, "Oh, Mother of God." And we looked, and it was so gruesome, so horrific. The person had been wearing jeans, and the piece of the body that had been brought in, the leg was covered by like a torn portion of blue jean. And so they emptied the pocket, and there was change in it, and they put that in a separate kind of plastic bag. And then someone said that this was the other portion of the body that had been brought in a little bit earlier, I guess before I had arrived, and that portion of the body had a cell phone. So they had the cell phone. So they, put this portion of torso and leg into a body bag. And, at that point, the older doctor said that like he had to take a break. His badge said PGY3, which meant he was a third-year resident. I was a PGY 4 at the time because I had finished my residency and now I was a cardiology fellow. So it just hit me that of all the doctors in the room, I had the most experience. I was actually the most senior doctor. And that just made me feel incredibly uncomfortable because I had absolutely no clue what to do in that situation. I had always felt very queasy in medical school, in the anatomy lab, dissecting cadavers. I had never been really interested in pathology, and it wasn't what I went into medicine for. And suddenly I developed this almost panic that they were going to ask me to run the show, which is basically what they did. This doctor said, I have to leave. Apparently he'd been there for a few hours. And the female doctor also said that she had to get away. And she looked at me and she said, are you a doctor? And I said, yes. And she said, great, you can take over. That was it. And they both left. And I think there was just me and one other. It's all very vague. I don't quite even remember if there was another physician with me. I think there was. And then there were the two medical students and the nurse. We were just there. A few minutes later, they brought in more body parts, and it was hard to tell what it was, what the parts were. There was it looked like it was maybe a liver, part of a spleen. So I was like, I think this is a spleen. I think this is a liver. These med students and this nurse were just writing that down, and then they were putting those parts into a body bag. They were bringing in portions of bodies, and it wasn't clear whether these basically disembodied organs, whether they were from one person, from several people, and it wasn't clear whether we should put them all together or we should put them separately. There were piles and piles of unused body bags in the dressing room. And, looking around the store, as we're doing this work, there were all these headless mannequins that they had used to, model their clothing. And there were piles and piles of neatly folded Brooks Brothers shirts in different colors. I just remember the colors so well. They were muted because there was a lot of ash and dust, but you could still make out that there were blue shirts and pink shirts and yellow shirts and white shirts. And then there were all these unused yellow body bags. The surrealism of the experience it was hard to fathom. I thought I was in a movie. This had to be some sort of setup. We were in a men's clothing emporium. I mean, I'd worn Brooks Brothers clothes in residency, when I wanted to dress up. And here we were, in a clothing store, being asked to do these sort of impossible thing. I remember thinking that, I had just finished my residency. In my third year of residency, a lot of my friends had done international electives. They'd gone to impoverished areas of Asia to work in public health and infectious disease. And they would talk about how difficult it was to work in areas with so few resources. But we had plenty of resources. It was netherworld medicine. We were in some sort of conception of Dante's Inferno. It was just unbelievable. In that situation, as you can imagine, book knowledge is totally useless. You could never simulate in a medical school or residency training exercise what we were faced with. So it was all about improvising. But you're improvising with the background of such monumental tragedy that it makes you feel really uncomfortable. Just even a simple thing like, do we put all the body parts into one bag or separate bags? I remember thinking, if you put them in separate bags, what if they end up getting separated? That didn't seem right. But putting the remains of several victims together in a bag just seemed wrong. And it's how do you identify? How do you figure this out? It seemed at the moment incredibly important that we do the right thing. We figure this out. And then to still have to do it and have to do it rather quickly with people watching, it was so hard. And I'm not surprised that the other two doctors they left. They had to leave. They couldn't do it. And after a while, I don't remember how long, I just started to feel physically ill. I just couldn't be there anymore. And I said that I was going to have to leave, which I did. I left and went out the sort of back entrance and went back to the MASH unit where I had initially been at that firehouse. The whole experience kind of wilted me. And I wasn't a stranger to emergencies, right? I mean, in cardiology, we dealt with emergencies all the time. Patients go into cardiogenic shock, go into acute heart failure, go into life-threatening arrhythmia, having a heart attack. So I was used to dealing with emergencies, but this seemed of a different scale. It seems kind of trivial, but my wife was very upset that I was down there. She kept saying that she really wanted me to get out of there, that if I wasn't going to be in the hospital, then I needed to be at home with her. All along, we'd been trying to get pregnant, and we were actually pursuing in vitro fertilization. And so at the end of the day, when I was getting ready to leave, I said, I'm coming home now. And she said, fine. Can you just stop by the Apthorpe pharmacy and pick up our IVF materials? And I remember thinking oh my God, no, I can't do that. So life was still going on. We still had plans to, have a baby. So that didn't stop. But she had no idea of what I had gone through that day. Eventually, it's probably I don't know, but the next day, if I remember correctly, we went back to the hospital and we just went back to our training routine. I believe I was in the echocardiography lab and was learning how to read echocardiograms and how to scan patients, and went back to taking call. In the midst of all that, bodies were removed from the rubble and they were processed in these sort of mobile morgues that were parked just off First Avenue between Bellevue and Tisch Hospital. And so you could kind of smell that work. In between my work at Bellevue and then we'd have lunch conference at Tisch, I'd have to run in between the two hospitals and pass these trucks and smell the decaying bodies. It was very stark. So much of my life in my first couple of years after 9/11 was spent in the hospital, taking care of patients, in a very busy training program. Like I said earlier, life goes on. Your married life goes on. The kinds of things that you're planning to do goes on. Your professional development, specifically, we still had to make a baby. I still had to do my training. And then longer term, worries came up about my exposure to, all the dust and all the dangerous chemicals that I had been exposed to. I think for a portion of the time I was down there, I don't even remember having a mask. For a while, I developed what I thought were pulmonary problems I had never had in my whole life, like asthma. And so all these things are going on, right? But no one can really see what you've suffered in your heart. No one can erase those images. And so you have to continue to function with this almost terrible secret. You can talk about it, but no one can really appreciate it. So I remember those months afterwards just resenting these things I had to do. There was no time to recoup, recover, rehabilitate. And, I was relatively newly married too. So there was that whole thing to negotiate, I mean, it was a wonderful time, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it was a stressful time. There's kind of your feet are in these concrete boots. You don't want to get up sometimes in the morning, to do what you have to do. You have nightmares, I had this recurring nightmare that I was actually in the building and I was plummeting down the various floors that were collapsing, and I was collapsing. I was going down. I couldn't stop having that. I mean, that eventually, fortunately, stopped, but I had it for quite some time. And so the hardest part was continuing to live your life and kind of continue to follow the script that had been laid out for yourself, by yourself, and then feeling like everything had changed. But not everyone could really understand why it had changed or how it had changed. Yes, they knew you were down there. They knew you had seen some very terrible things, but they'd never really understand it because they weren't there. I successfully finished my training, became a cardiologist, wrote the books I wanted to write. I did those things. Maybe I had a little guilt afterwards. I was still able to do those things, and so many people had perished. But I still never really talked about 9/11. I didn't want to talk about it. When 9/11 came around, I never posted anything on social media. I kind of ignored it for years and years. After the 9/11 memorial, I never went. Eventually I went. I took my kids. It sent shivers up my spine, The way they did it was, I think, really incredible. Incredible how the water flows into that sort of bottomless pit. It really, really just floored me. I think it really encapsulated how I felt. The water is flowing down into this cavern that seems bottomless, like it's actually leading into hell. That was the experience for me at that Brooks Brothers morgue, that I had kind of entered a sort of hell. That was very powerful to me. There was a young woman who survived, who was removed from the rubble with a crushed leg, but nothing else. She was admitted to Bellevue, and she was being seen by the arrhythmia service. And I remember hearing about her at conferences that she had developed these arrhythmias that were very difficult to manage. It was very clear to me even then, and even more so now as a cardiologist, that the stress and the trauma of what she had gone through was almost certainly precipitating these incessant and essentially life-threatening arrhythmias. So this was something that caused me to revisit that experience down at Ground Zero those 2 days, really for weeks afterward, because we'd talk about this patient or we'd talk about other people who had been retrieved and had survived. So, I've always been fascinated by the heart, both as a biomechanical pump, which is how modern medicine conceives of the heart, but also by the cultural and metaphorical meanings of the heart, especially the emotional meanings, something that has engaged the cultural imagination for millennia, really. The heart, it's like the only organ in the body that sort of palpably moves, that you can feel moving. The heart has been thought throughout history as the container, the vessel of human emotions. Bravery, fear, love are all thought to be contained within the heart. And when I heard about this patient, who had survived and had developed these incessant arrhythmias, it just drove home to me the point that the emotions have a profound effect, on the heart and on heart rhythms and so on. And that led me to think more deeply about the heart as not just a mechanical pump, but as an emotional canvas. How important the emotions are in leading to cardiac pathology, both in an acute sense, like in this young woman who developed these life-threatening arrhythmias, but also in a chronic sense, how emotional stress over long periods of time can lead to worsening heart disease. Through the course of my training, I came across kind of the paradigm of this sort of emotional heart intersecting with the biological heart. The sort of archetype of this paradigm is the broken heart syndrome, where patients who suffer severe emotional upset, like from the breakup of a relationship or the death of a loved one, can actually have physical effects, can suffer physical effects on the heart. The heart can actually acutely change shape. I mean, just to give you one small example, I mean, the patients we had who had defibrillators, they were getting shocked more and more after 9/11, probably because of post-traumatic stress. That was just striking to me, The Greeks were onto something. The ancient philosophers were onto something. It was clear that there was an overlap between this emotional object that the Greeks thought was sort of this purely metaphorical object, or the way we conceive it today as a purely metaphorical object, the heart as the container, the vessel of human emotions, and this biomechanical pump, the concept of which evolved from 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, to the point where we started to think of the heart as being just a entity that had pipes that got clogged and had wires that sometimes crossed and caused arrhythmias. And we kind of sort of conceptualized the heart as this purely mechanical object. But it was so clear to me that it's both, and these two types of hearts overlap. And so I would say that this experience led me as a cardiologist to think more deeply about the effects of the emotions on the heart. And it was an uphill struggle because, throughout my entire fellowship, no one really talked about the emotions. That just seemed like a fuzzy concept. We talked about the resistance of coronary arteries. We talked about the capacitance of cardiac chambers. We talked about all these sort of physics concepts that I was very familiar with and comfortable with, but no one really talked about, how emotional stress can affect heart health. Even today, the American Heart Association doesn't recognize emotional stress as a key modifiable risk factor for heart disease. They're coming around to it, but they still don't officially recognize it like they do cholesterol or high blood pressure or so on. Part of that is because we can lower cholesterol and we can lower blood pressure with medications. It's much harder to treat emotional disruption, emotional stress, like what happened on the scale, or what happened on 9/11. So I think that experience really had lingering effects on my career. It eventually motivated me to, write my last book, which is Heart of History, which really explored this theme, much more deeply. Anyone who lived in New York City during those weeks and months after 9/11 remembers how the city came together. I remember outside Bellevue, there were all these posters of, people who were missing, and it was just heart-wrenching. People lent a helping hand. Even in the hospital, I feel like things changed for some time. People were just a little gentler, a little nicer, a sense of we're all in this together. And for me, the long-term change was that, I pivoted from wanting to do kind of hardcore cardiology, the way that my professors had done it, the way that some of my co-fellows were doing it, into a sort of a more human-based cardiology, which is sort of in keeping with why I went into medicine in the first place, because I really wanted to make a difference in people's lives. And so pretty soon after 9/11, I decided to specialize in congestive heart failure, which I believe is the most humanistic of all the cardiology disciplines. It's not purely imaging like cardiac ultrasound. It's not just doing procedures like putting in stents. It's looking at the whole person, the person who has a rhythm, who might need a stent, who needs imaging, but is also a real person who's suffering with a incurable disease. And I just realized that that's the kind of cardiologist I wanted to be. The average amount of time that a doctor gives to a patient to speak freely, uninterrupted, is about 16 seconds. That's not enough time because so much of what's ailing the patient isn't necessarily the chest pain, but it's like what's going on in their lives. I don't know if I would have been a different doctor if I hadn't gone through this, but I do believe that the experience And the paths that led me down, those paths made me a better doctor. The experience of 9/11 and all the sort of emotional overtones, all the sort of emotional repercussions in the months afterwards, it's hard not to think about the finiteness of life when you're as young as I was or at least how I remember how young I was, and you're in a morgue, in a clothing store, processing body parts on a day that you thought you'd be doing something completely different. It's hard for that not to have a profound effect